Hold on. There we are. Hey, everybody. Finally got that unmuted. My name is Tom Springer, and I am going to be talking about historic bridges today. This is a presentation I gave at Bridge Day back in February. Hold on, I'm trying to click on my presentation here. Seems like years ago, back when that presentation was done, but it is an overview of the laws and policies and the decision-making process. It is completely different than Michael's presentation, but we're still sharing the hour, so I'm going to talk relatively fast as I walk through this and have obviously time for questions and answers at the end. I hope so. Back in Bridge Day, and the same today, the objectives of the presentation are to discuss 3 different federal laws that influence historic bridges. Most of us know 2, but there's another one out there I'll present later on in the presentation. And when those laws apply, an overview of the process on how we make the decisions. There's a phrase from one of the laws that's all possible planning to minimize harm. And that is a takeaway I hope that project managers and design leads take from this presentation and this talk, because that's sort of our marching orders. That's what we have to do. Talk about commitments and also talk about lots of examples with pictures, of course. So the first law that most people know of when it comes to historic bridges is Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act. 36 CFR 800 passed in 1966, and it is a process law, meaning that as decision makers, we have to follow a process. And if we're to be challenged whether or not we were compliant with Section 106, we'd be challenged whether or not we took the steps and followed the process. The outcome was dependent on the process. One of the quotes from the law sort of sets the stage here. It says, historic property significant to the nation's heritage are being lost or substantially altered, often inadvertently, with increasing frequency. And the goal with this law is to curb that and preserve our historic resources. So the question that's been asked a lot, and sort of get surprised sometimes at some of the answers I get, is when does the Section 106 apply? So I took a direct quote from the law. It says, prior to the approval or the expenditure of any federal funds or the undertaking, or prior to the issuance of on the undertaking or of any license, shall take into account the effects of the object eligible for the National Register of Historic Places. So let's see. I don't know what happened in my polls, but I had a poll. If I can find it, I'll send it later. So when do the laws apply? In short, it's federal funds or federal permit. If you have a historic bridge over a stream, you're most likely going to need a federal permit. Therefore, almost always, these bridges have to undergo Section 106 process. Another question that I was surprised at some of the answers I get is, what is an undertaking? Well, that's pretty much anything. Rehab, replacement, inventory removal, really any federal signature or federal actions. I've had some people say, well, hey, if we're just rehabbing the bridge, then Section 106 does not apply. And that is not true. Rehabbing is indeed an undertaking if you have federal funds or a federal permit. So the second law that governs historic bridges is Section 4F of the 1966 U.S. Department of Transportation Act. It's 23 CFR 774. You should, if you're not familiar with it, write that down and go look it up. It's pretty straightforward. But it is a substantive law rather than a process law, where it says you can and cannot do certain actions. So I'm going to read a quote here from the law. And my intent with this is to communicate sort of the scope of work that you have to take when 4F applies. So 4F has a programmatic agreement for historic bridges, and thank goodness it does. And this is a quote from that programmatic agreement. This statement sets forth the basis for programmatic Section 4F approval that there are no feasible and prudent alternatives to the use of certain historic bridges, structures to be replaced or rehabbed, back to that, applies to both, with federal funds, and that the project includes all possible planning to minimize harm. So I opened with the slide with the phrase all possible planning to minimize harm, because that's exactly what we have to do. And we have to actually do the hard work and the analysis and the cost estimates and layout plans and come up with pros and cons on the prudent and feasible alternatives and make an informed decision. So a lot of times, very smart people and experienced people in this business look at a bridge and they're like, there's no way we can rehab that. I know what the answer is. We got to do this. And a lot of times they're right. But we still have to go through the decision-making process and document and look at all the alternatives, come up with the comparison matrix and the facts. And then, we end up where the person who knew what they were talking about said, I told you we'd be there. It's like, that's okay, because we had to document so that we're legally sufficient and comply with 4F. So, quiz time here. And I don't have my poll in front of me, but here we have a state-funded rehab project. It's just a deck replacement railing. You can see that at the construction on the top, and it's all state-funded. So, does Section 106 apply? Sorry, I don't have my poll. I'm going to assume that somebody said no, and the answer is yes, it does. Because see this equipment in this pad in this stream? That is a permittable activity, and that requires a U.S. Army Corps of Engineers permit, and with it, all of the federal laws and policies that govern our federally funded and federally permitted projects. So yes, this is a federally funded, requires a Section 106, even though it's state funded in rehab. All right, the 106 process, just real high level quick review. One thing we have to do is identify consulting parties, and that is engaging local landowners, local officials, local historians, and often these individuals have insight onto the historic resources that we're dealing with and have great solutions. And it can get a little messy sometimes, but if you really engage it, it's the process that can make a project really rich and do well. We identify not just historic bridge, but also historic resources surrounding the bridge. Is it in a historic district or a historic farm nearby? Of course, we assess the effects of our action on the historic resources, and then work with the consulting parties and other people to avoid, minimize, and mitigate any adverse effects we might have. At the end of the Section 106 process, there are 3 possible findings that the state SHPO's office, State Historic Preservation Officer, will issue. A no effect, which is most of our projects. No, it's not historic, and there are no historic resources. We took a look, we documented it, we coordinated it, and it's no effect. That's most of them. If we have a historic bridge, the next best thing you can get is no adverse effect. And that is always our plan A. We always want to save and restore our historic bridges, but sometimes we can't, and we lose the bridge, and we get an adverse effect. That's plan B, last resort. We lose our historic resource. The phrase out with the old, in with the new applies, even though that is sort of our last resort, right? But that is an option in the process. But even so, even when we lose our resource, we still have to do all possible planning to minimize harm. And the way we do that planning is usually try to avoid, for example, if the only historic element is the stone abutment, can we pour concrete behind the abutment, a new abutment? If there are stone walls nearby, can we put the diversion or the new bridge away from the stone walls? Avoid historic buildings, or if there's railing, can we keep that railing? Or if we can't, can we minimize down to the point where there's no adverse effect, just rehab things or fix the railing, provide new members of a trust. I'll show examples of all these. And we engage our locals and our elected officials. I'll show examples of how we've done that, and that's helped us minimize or get a no adverse effect. And then we make commitments that we communicate through construction. When we have an adverse effect, our last resort, we have to have the documentation that we did all of our possible planning to minimize harm, We have to have an alternatives analysis to present to FHWA and for the file and to be legally sufficient, where we really have to look at, new bridge on new alignment, or widening, or go left or right, or no build alternative, or rehabs, or different levels of rehab, and ask ourselves the question, what is the real purpose and need? Is this a major thoroughfare that needs unposted, no weight restrictions, or is it barely used out in the middle of nowhere, leading just to a couple of houses? So what do we have to do to serve the traveling public? So we document our replacement. We have to keep all of our commitments the whole way through, and usually we have a memorandum of agreement signed by FHWA, SHPO, Kentucky Transportation Cabinet, and consulting parties as well. And of course, it's all legally binding. It's to be carried all the way through. All right, so with some examples. First one you have is in District 1. I'm going to try to go across the state with different examples. This is a really cool old wooden trestle over a railroad track here, and it's just not feasible to rehab this bridge. And we're losing these types of bridges all across the state. But you just can't, put reinforced wood or bungee cords or duct tape like I would do to rehab it. So we're going to lose it, and it's out with the old, and we're going to build an efficient, new concrete, whatever the engineers deem appropriate. And then we will mitigate for that loss of the bridge outside of design and outside of construction. So another cool example is in District 2. We have this cool little 60-foot long pony truss. And we have a bridge like this where we are able to take it out of its setting and relocate it. We are required to market it and give it away. For this bridge, we put it out on Facebook and Twitter and all kinds of things, and we got 7 potential applicants, which was really awesome. Some really creative ideas on what different people wanted to do with this bridge if they could get it. We ended up picking a nearby city. They're going to incorporate it into their trail system. It's still a loss of the historic structure, so it's still an adverse effect, but it's part of our planning to minimize the harm and preserve our resources. We're able to repurpose this bridge in the next county over. In District 4 in Taylor County down in Campbellsville, we have this historic bridge, and what makes it historic is the railing. So what we decided to do was put back classic railing, which most people are familiar with, but through the consulting party process, when we engaged the city leaders and the mayor and the county judge executive and other people around, we came up with a commitment that we would remove these posts, and you can see that there are names inscribed there of the, past city council members or founding fathers of the city or something like that. We remove those and then give them to the city, and they are going to incorporate them in that little park that you can see on the horizon. So the point I want to make with this slide and this example is that it took a lot of work. We met on site, and several phone calls and commitments, and memorandum of agreement, and all these things. Or actually, we didn't have an MOA, but we had all these commitments. And it comes down to one little line on the plan set, number 3 here, out of a list of 20 or so. It says remove and salvage existing decorative rail posts and basically give them to the city. So we're really putting a lot of faith in that sentence, that it gets the proper attention by the resident engineer, by the district, by the person overseeing construction, the inspectors, and the contractor, to make sure this legally binding commitment gets carried through. In this particular case, I know it did because I know who the contractor was, and I called him up, and I called the city up, and sure enough, they got the post. And so it all got communicated like it was supposed to, but there's always this level of anxiety because it may be a year or longer before between when that commitment was made and it actually goes to construction. So here's another example in Jefferson County. This is a historic bridge, 1940 WPA. It's a culvert, poured concrete, a very clean, cool-looking bridge that the locals actually really enjoy, and we're really glad that we were going to preserve it. So we met with the locals and consulting parties and the SHPO and everybody, And we said, well, we're going to keep the head walls, and that's really the only historic part. And the only way we communicated that to the construction industry was a little note here: north head wall to remain, and then down at the bottom, south head wall to remain. And that was included in the plans. And then I'm happy to report that I went back out a few months later, and the bridge has been rebuilt. The deck has been poured and rebuilt, and there's new guardrail there for safety measures, as our safety people will be glad to know. And then the historic element of being the outside of that bridge did indeed remain. There's another bridge in Kenton County. This was actually the first bridge let for construction in the Bridge in Kentucky program. Is a historic bridge over an outstanding resource water. Had all the things going to make it complicated. The scope of work was to rebuild this deck, the railing in the deck. That's exactly what happened. Here's a picture after construction. If I have some historic-minded friends on this presentation, you're probably wincing at the color. Didn't pick out the color, but color is an important thing. And from here to forward, we're trying to always have either clear coating on concrete or just a concrete gray. But nonetheless, the railing was preserved per the plans, and we had no adverse effect on that historic bridge. Here's an example over in District 7. The only historic part of this bridge is this really impressive stone abutment. The rest of the bridge, the other abutment, are pretty generic. But what you have to know about this bridge is that it's in a historic district. In the horse farm country, people are very passionate about historic preservation. It's an absolutely gorgeous area. So take it out of that context, and you may approach this wall differently. But in that context, we made a strategic effort to redesign this bridge to barely touch that wall and put a new deck on it. Give a shout out to Stuart McIntosh at Crawford for doing a great job on designing this and making sure the notes are in place that wall was to remain. But again, the communication is one note on a plan. And so, our goal is that the engineering side and construction side is aware that when these little notes get on these plans, man, they came from a lot of work, a lot of meetings, a lot of discussion of alternatives in an effort to stay compliant with the laws, and very important part of the process. So real quick, talk about historic railing. I love this railing. It's the Art Deco look, cool little windows. And anytime we talk about historic railing, our engineer friends rightfully should always bring it up that railing is not MASH test certified, and it is therefore a liability, and somebody's going to wreck and they're going to sue everybody. And that is a very legitimate claim. Sometimes, though, railing like this will end up at the end of the process remaining for the bridge. In this particular bridge down in Casey County, that is not the case. We're losing this railing. We're going to replace it back with classic rail because classic rail is MASH test certified and it is safer. This is on a 45-mile-an-hour road out in the country. And that railing there's barely any shoulder, maybe no shoulder, and it is a hazard. But if you took that exact railing and put it in a city, for example, or in a historic district, or at a stop condition, or inside of a park, the process may very well lead us to keep that railing. And from the engineering and the safety side, you should raise your hand and say, hey, that's not MASH test certified, that's not safe. And that information should be on the table. But also part of the process is we may end up keeping that historic railing, may have to have a design exception to preserve our historic resources for that context. So it's always context driven. And we run into that conversation all the time. Here's an example where we're going to lose this bridge because those really cool stone piers and abutments, which are, I think, WPA constructed, they've lost their integrity. They have huge cracks in them. But we met with the county judge executive and other people through the 106 process, and they said, hey, we would love to have these stones and fold them into our trail system in our park, which is about 5 miles away. So it's a great idea. So we ended up losing the bridge. We have an adverse effect, but through the all possible planning to minimize harm goals, we were able to keep and at least tip our hat and recognize the cool stones and the hard work that was put into these, and still make them part of our part of the local community down in Perry County. So, covered bridges. We all know covered bridges are historic and protected not just by Section 4F and 106, but there are other laws that protect them too. We all know that, but I want to use this slide as a transition to talk about truss bridges. Because truss bridges are the new covered bridges. We are losing our truss bridges around the state. And in fact, a lot of well-meaning structural engineers and maintenance folks have a goal to remove truss bridges because they can be a lot of maintenance cost and a lot of work. But every truss bridge is historic. Every truss bridge is eligible, and every truss bridge must be approached with a historic preservation mindset and goal. Maybe you can't always do it, but that is definitely the goal that we should strive for. So when we talk about truss bridges, when we look at the basic question of what is really needed, what is the transportation need for this project? What's on the other side? Is it just a house, or are we carrying a coal across of it? So once you understand that, you can do an alternatives analysis. This is what we've done in Bridging Kentucky, and an alternatives analysis, not left or right or new bridge or different types of bridges, but an alternative analysis is what would it take to increase the load carrying capacity to the next level. If it's at 3 tons right now, what can we do to get it up to 18 tons? Or what can we do to get up to 40 tons? Or what can we do to get it so it's no posting at all? And to document those different options and put costs to them. And sometimes we can and sometimes we can't. This particular bridge in Elliott County, Kentucky 32, is just half a mile to the left. Brand new bridge, brand new road, carries all the loads and vehicles you want. This bridge was they want to keep it. The cultural resource centers nearby, the county judge executive wants to keep it. So we're going to keep this and rehab this bridge, but it has a much less ton load carrying capacity than it would if it were full unposted was what was needed. So it's a good win on that one. Same down here in Laurel County. This bridge was currently posted at 19 tons, and through a super strengthening rehab project of replacing several of the members of the truss, especially underneath in various places, we're going to get it to no low posting, and it can carry whatever rating or whatever traffic across. So that was a great success story too. All right, the third law I want to talk about that touches on historic preservation is not one that really affects people in the historic preservation world, or the SHPO or Department of Environmental Analysis or the historic consultants, but it's 23 U.S.C. 144, which is the National Bridge and Tunnel Inventory and Inspection Standards. This law governs a lot of what our bridge engineers do in terms of inspection, rehab design, and overall approach to maintaining our bridge structures. In the preamble of this law is a great write-up on historic bridges, and I think it's worth reading here. I think it really ties it all together. It says, Congress hereby finds and declares it to be in the national interest to encourage the rehabilitation, reuse, and preservation of bridges significant in American history, architecture, engineering, and culture. Historic bridges are an important link to our past, serve as a safe and vital transportation routes in the present, and can represent significant resources in the future. And that is so true. I feel a lot of times our approach as a whole is to find the most efficient and cost-effective means to meet the needs of the traveling public. And that is a great approach. And that is what we need as engineers and what we need on most of our bridges. But when it comes to historic bridges, we got to broaden out our thinking a little bit and realize that this bridge is part of our culture and part of our history and means so much to so many people. It's more than just an efficient transportation corridor. And I just love that language. I think it challenges us to think in the past, present, and future about preservation. I have a few examples on that as we round up here. So this awesome truss bridge here is in White Mills, Kentucky, in Hardin County, which is where I grew up. And as a kid, I went to White Mills Christian camp every summer. I played peanut league baseball, or at least sat on the bench anyway. Wasn't even good enough to play peanut or little league, but I was on the team there, and we would drive over this bridge. I can hear my mom's old LTD, probably weighed about 10 tons, going over that bridge and the wood bumbling underneath it. Scared to death. And now that I know what I know, I probably should be scared to death. This bridge today really isn't even needed. There's a brand new bridge just downstream, half a mile or so, and carry whatever you want over it. But boy, from a community standpoint and from a historic standpoint, this bridge is significant. I've had a bridge maintenance guy from District 4 area tell me that there are parts you can literally put your hand through. There's so much rust in it. But when you turn around, you come over this bridge and you drive straight, or walk straight maybe, what you see is the White Mills Christian Camp Hotel. And this hotel is very old and significant. I actually have a friend whose grandparents met at this hotel at a USO dance before her grandfather went off to serve in World War II. And they have a picture of them standing in front of this bridge. Obviously survived the war and had a family, and generations later, that bridge and that picture is significant, right, to them. But there's thousands and thousands of stories. And that's the vision, and that's the idea about our historic preservation, is to realize that how critical these are to our community. All right, so as I round up, I'm going to show you a picture here. I have this print in my office. It's a painting by a man named Grant Wood. And Grant Wood is in Iowa. He painted American Gothic, right? Everybody knows that painting. This painting's called Still City. There's a lot going on in the painting, and what he's trying to convey is a change from an agrarian economy to an industrial economy. Obviously, you see the farmland, but most of you probably already seen the pony truss here. And then to the left, there's a guy on a little horse, right, in the agrarian economy, and he's approaching the bridge to support the industrial economy. And back here, they've dug the mountain up and gotten all kinds of limestone, and that's what the city is known for. So for this presentation, I went online to see if this bridge from the iconic centerpiece of a Grant Wood painting is still around. And it's not. This is an aerial photograph of a new, still being girder, standard, efficient, no load restriction, awesome, efficient bridge, right? I can assume, I don't know, that maybe this pier in the middle of the stream, or maybe the pier under that bridge, that red dot is, or part of that pony truss. I don't know. Maybe that pony truss was just in horrible shape and had to go. It was out with the old, in with the new, just washed down the stream. Looks like a pretty big stream. Fell apart. I don't know. Don't know the story. But I do know this, that it's gone, right? And when it's gone, it's gone. There's nothing you can do to get it back. Maybe this engineering and historic community worked really hard and did all they could to minimize and mitigate and all possible planning, or maybe they didn't. Maybe the engineering community or whomever just went in and replaced the bridge. I don't know. But it's a significant bridge, and we can't get it back. So I have one slide left. It is my recap slide about the takeaways. What does Tom want you to remember from his historic bridge talk? All right, preservation first. 'Tis the law. Decided to still the name of the Kentucky Derby horse that I was hoping would win. But yes, preservation first is the law. Rehab or replace, my engineering friends, it matters not. It's federal funds or federal permit that requires you to follow the historic preservation laws. All possible planning to minimize harm is your marching orders. That is what we are to do. Out with the old and in with the new is indeed possible. As we've seen, it has to happen, but it's the last resort. Commitments are legally binding, and we have to carry those things all the way through. They're not suggestions. They're not just random notes on plans. They are things that have to happen. Trusses are indeed the new covered bridge, and they are all eligible, and we should work at preserving them. And we, environmental design consultants, consultant parties, public, FHWA, DEA, SHPO, we really do work hard to move projects forward, preserve our past, but it's all for naught without all of your help. That is the last slide I have, everybody. So I'm going to exit that. And if anybody has any questions, I'm not really seeing those, but hopefully if they are in the pop-up window, I will see them later.
Yeah, Tom, there are a couple questions in there for you.
Nope.
So can you hear me, Tom?
I can hear you, Michael.
Okay. So I assume everybody else can too. I had a question from Donna going back to my presentation. She asked how we started right away before an approved NEPA document. I should have clarified that we didn't actually make offers. They did all the prep work leading to that point, including appraisals. This job was pretty easy to do that on just because a lot of the impacts were the same. The interchanges impacted a lot of the same. The widening along 461 impacted a lot of the same property owners. So they did not make offers before that NEPA document. And then there was a CE3. That was your other question. What level? It was a CE3 document. Tom, you have a question from Brian James. He asked if a historic bridge requires a replacement to a piece of the bridge. Is that considered adverse? I guess you're answering, aren't you?
Yes, I see that now. And the answer is, of course, maybe. It has to be taken into context. At the best, it would be no adverse. It wouldn't be no effect because it's a historic bridge. But if it's the railing, are we going to just replace that in kind, or do we lose the railing? So it all depends. I've got examples where that very question ended with no adverse effect, and examples where it ended with adverse effect. I want to send my short maybe answered back. You mentioned about what sounds like insufficient on plans with a note. How would you suggest that it have been addressed? Yeah, that it's out short of putting highlights and red flashing lights and big red arrows to that note, that's about as good as we can do. I mean, notes are notes on plans, but I think we try to include cap notes, which do stand out a little bit more, or special notes in the plans. When anything there's something sort of random, like saving those